Marcus Webb walked through the Los Angeles airport, with his leather briefcase in hand and his first-class boarding pass ready on his phone. He wore a perfectly fitted navy blue suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, but he never liked to think about money that way. The airport was busy as usual, with families rushing to gates and business travelers checking their watches. Marcus had flown this same route from Los Angeles to New York at least 50 times in the past 2 years. He knew exactly where to go and how long everything would take. He was the founder and owner of Webb Technologies, a company that created software for hospitals and medical centers across the country. His company was worth over $3 billion, though Marcus rarely mentioned that to anyone. He believed in letting his work speak for itself. The first-class check-in counter stood ahead of him with its blue velvet ropes and special lighting that made it look more important than the regular counters. A woman in her late 40s stood behind the counter wearing the airline uniform of a dark blazer and a crisp white shirt. Her name tag read Patricia Stone. Marcus approached with a polite smile and placed his phone on the counter, showing his digital boarding pass for seat 2A. Patricia looked at him with an expression that Marcus had seen too many times in his life. It was not quite a frown, but not a welcoming look either. She picked up a small scanner and pointed it at his phone, but did not scan it. Instead, she just stared at the screen and then at Marcus and then back at the screen again. Marcus waited patiently because he had learned over the years that patience often revealed people's true intentions. Patricia finally spoke in a voice that sounded professional, but carried something cold underneath. She told Marcus that she would need to see additional identification beyond his boarding pass. Marcus raised one eyebrow slightly but kept his expression calm. He had already provided his passport when he checked his luggage an hour earlier, and his boarding pass was legitimate and paid for with his own credit card. He asked Patricia if there was some kind of problem with his ticket or his reservation. Patricia did not answer his question directly, but instead told him that the airline had been experiencing issues with fraudulent upgrades and ticket scams recently. She said she needed to verify that his first-class ticket was legitimately purchased and not some kind of scam or mistake. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but he refused to let it show on his face. He had built his entire business empire by staying calm under pressure and thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He told Patricia very politely that he had purchased the ticket himself exactly 1 week ago, directly from the airline's official website. He offered to pull up his confirmation email and credit card statement if that would help resolve her concerns. Before Patricia could respond, another passenger approached the first-class counter from behind Marcus. This man was white with graying hair at his temples and wore an expensive watch that caught the light. His name was Greg Hamilton, and he held his boarding pass in his hand without any concern or worry on his face. Patricia's entire expression changed the moment she saw Greg. Her face brightened into a warm smile, and she welcomed him with enthusiasm that had been completely absent when dealing with Marcus. She told Greg that everything looked perfect and she wished him an excellent flight. Greg thanked her and walked past Marcus toward the gate without a single question being asked about his ticket or identification. Marcus watched this happen and felt anger building inside him like water heating to a boil, but he was not the kind of man who exploded or made scenes. He was the kind of man who documented everything and built cases and won battles through strategy rather than emotion. He calmly pulled out his phone again and showed Patricia his original purchase confirmation from the airline's website, with the date and time and transaction number clearly visible. He also showed her his credit card statement with the charge listed and his frequent flyer account that showed his status as a platinum elite member with over 2 million miles flown with this exact airline. Patricia barely glanced at the phone screen. She told Marcus that digital documents could be doctored or faked these days, and that she would need to call security to verify his identity and the legitimacy of his ticket. Her voice had grown louder as she spoke, and several other passengers in the area turned to look at what was happening. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, and he knew exactly what they were thinking. He knew the assumptions being made about him in that moment. He asked Patricia in a very calm and controlled voice if she was seriously telling him that she needed to call security because he was trying to board a flight with a ticket he had legally purchased. A young flight attendant named Kelly Brooks had been standing nearby preparing passenger lists for boarding. She heard the conversation and walked over to see what was causing the delay. Kelly looked confused as she listened to Patricia explain that she suspected Marcus of trying to board with fraudulent documents. Kelly picked up Marcus's phone and looked at the boarding pass and then at his identification. She told Patricia that everything appeared to be completely in order, and that they needed to start boarding the flight soon. Patricia's face turned slightly red, and she informed Kelly in a sharp tone that she was the senior gate agent and she made the final decisions about who could board and who could not. Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out one of his business cards. The card was simple with just his name, his title as Chief Executive Officer, and the name of his company. He placed it on the counter in front of Patricia and suggested that she might want to search his name online while they waited for security. Patricia did not even look at the card. She picked up her desk phone and called airport security, reporting what she described as a suspicious passenger attempting to board with questionable credentials. Marcus stood there and waited because running would make things worse and arguing would make things worse and losing his temper would definitely make things worse. He had learned these lessons long ago. Within 3 minutes, 2 security officers arrived at the counter. One was a man in his 30s named Danny Price, and the other was a woman in her 40s named Lisa Grant. Both wore dark blue uniforms and had serious expressions on their faces. Marcus noticed that at least 6 passengers were now recording the entire scene on their phones. He was glad for that because the truth needed witnesses. Security officer Danny Price approached Marcus with a careful expression that tried to be professional without being threatening. He spoke in a measured tone and asked Marcus if he would mind coming with them to answer a few questions about his travel documents. Marcus looked directly at Danny and asked a simple question in return. He wanted to know if he was being detained or if he was free to refuse this request. Danny shifted his weight from one foot to the other and explained that they just needed to verify some information, and that it would only take a few minutes. He tried to make it sound routine and normal, but Marcus knew better. Nothing about this situation was routine or normal. Marcus decided that cooperation was his best option at this point. He told Danny that he would cooperate fully and completely, but he wanted to make something very clear first. He stated loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear that he had done absolutely nothing wrong and that the gate agent was racially profiling him and that multiple witnesses were recording this entire interaction on their phones. Danny glanced around and saw all the phones pointed in their direction. His expression changed slightly, and Marcus could see the concern in his eyes. Danny suggested they move to the security office to sort everything out quickly and privately. Marcus followed both security officers through the busy terminal while carrying his briefcase and maintaining his dignity. People stared as they walked past, and Marcus kept his head high and his expression calm. The security office was a small room with plain white walls and a desk with 2 computers. Lisa Grant gestured for Marcus to sit in a plastic chair, while she and Danny stood near the desk. Marcus remained standing because sitting felt like giving up some kind of power in this situation. He placed his briefcase on the floor and pulled out his wallet, which contained everything they could possibly need to verify his identity. Handed over his passport, which showed his full legal name and his photograph, and stamps from countries around the world where he had traveled for business. He provided his driver's license from California with his current address in Beverly Hills. He showed them 3 different credit cards, including the one he used to purchase the airplane ticket. He pulled up his company identification card on his phone, which had his photo and his title as Chief Executive Officer of Web Technologies. He opened his email and showed them the original ticket purchase confirmation with every detail clearly visible. He showed them the credit card statement with the exact charge from the airline appearing right there in black and white. Lisa sat down at the computer and typed Marcus's name into the search engine. Marcus watched her face change as she read whatever appeared on the screen. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened slightly, and then she looked up at Marcus with an expression that mixed surprise with embarrassment. She told Danny to come look at the computer screen, and Danny read it, and his face showed the same reaction. Lisa turned to Marcus and apologized for the inconvenience. She said that everything was clearly legitimate and that he was free to board his flight. Her voice had completely changed from suspicious to respectful in just a few seconds. Marcus appreciated the apology, but it was not enough to fix what had happened. He told Lisa that his flight was scheduled to board in less than 15 minutes and that he wanted a clear explanation for why he was singled out when other passengers were allowed to board without any questions at all. Lisa exchanged a long look with Danny, and neither of them seemed to know what to say. Finally, Danny explained that they were just following procedure based on what the gate agent reported to them. Marcus pointed out that the gate agent had no legitimate reason to report anything, because all his documents were valid from the very beginning. He asked if they honestly believed he would have been treated the same way if he looked like Greg Hamilton, who had been waved through without a single question. Neither security officer answered that question because they both knew the answer, and saying it out loud would make them part of the problem. Lisa promised that they would note this incident in their official report, and that Marcus was completely free to go board his flight now. Marcus picked up his briefcase and walked out of the security office, but the anger inside him had not decreased at all. If anything, it had grown stronger because he knew that this happened to people every single day, and most of them did not have the resources or power to fight back. He thought about the college student trying to get home for the holidays, or the teacher flying to visit family, or the nurse heading to a medical conference. What happened to them when they got pulled aside and questioned and humiliated? When Marcus returned to the gate area, he noticed immediately that Patricia Stone was no longer at the counter. Kelly Brooks was there instead, and she looked genuinely distressed. She saw Marcus approaching and rushed over to meet him before he reached the counter. She apologized repeatedly and told him that she had informed the captain about what had happened. She said that Patricia had been temporarily removed from duty, and that the incident was being reported to corporate headquarters. Kelly offered to personally escort Marcus aboard the aircraft and to make sure his flight was as comfortable as possible. Marcus thanked Kelly for her kindness and followed her down the jetway toward the airplane. The jetway smelled like recycled air and cleaning products, and the carpet under his feet showed years of wear from millions of passengers. Kelly kept glancing back at him as if she was worried he might suddenly become angry or demanding. But Marcus was not angry at Kelly. She had tried to help when she could have easily stayed silent. She had spoken up when it would have been easier to just go along with Patricia's decisions. The first-class cabin of the aircraft had wide leather seats arranged in 2 rows, with plenty of space between them. Marcus found his seat 2A next to the window and placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment. He sat down and fastened his seatbelt and stared out the window at the busy airport outside. Other planes were taking off and landing, and ground crews were loading baggage and fueling aircraft. Everything looked normal and routine, but Marcus felt anything but normal. His hands were shaking slightly with anger that he had been holding back for the past 40 minutes. Kelly brought him a bottle of water and asked if he needed anything else before takeoff. Marcus thanked her and said he was fine, but he was not fine. As other passengers boarded the plane, he noticed several of them staring at him with recognition in their eyes. They had seen the videos already. The incident had been recorded and posted online and was probably spreading across social media, even as the plane prepared for departure. Marcus pulled out his phone to check, but the flight attendant announced that all electronic devices needed to be set to airplane mode. He switched his phone off and leaned back in his seat and tried to calm his breathing. The plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway. Marcus watched Los Angeles disappear behind them as they climbed into the afternoon sky. He thought about what he was going to do next. He had not asked for this fight, but he was not the kind of man who backed down from challenges. He had faced racism before in business meetings where people assumed he was someone's assistant rather than the owner of the company. He had dealt with investors who questioned his intelligence and his capabilities based solely on the color of his skin. He had overcome every obstacle by working harder and being smarter and refusing to give up. This situation would be no different, except this time he had evidence and witnesses and public attention. This time he could do more than just succeed for himself. This time he could create real change that would help others. Marcus spent the next morning in his Manhattan office reviewing documents and preparing for what would come next. His office occupied the top floor of a building overlooking Central Park. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling and provided a view of the city that never failed to remind him of how far he had come. His assistant brought him coffee and a stack of newspapers that all featured his story on their front pages. The coverage was overwhelming and showed no signs of slowing down. Television news programs had devoted entire segments to discussing discrimination in air travel. Social media was flooded with personal stories from thousands of people who had experienced similar treatment. Claire arrived at 10 in the morning with a briefcase full of research and legal documents. She had spent the previous evening studying the airline's corporate structure and history. She showed Marcus records of previous discrimination complaints that had been quietly settled out of court. She had documentation of internal emails where company executives discussed complaints but took no meaningful action. She had financial reports showing that the airline spent millions on advertising and executive compensation, but almost nothing on diversity training or accountability measures. The evidence painted a clear picture of a company that had been ignoring systemic problems for years. At 11 o'clock, Marcus's phone rang. His assistant informed him that Victoria Lang, the chief executive officer of Skyline Airlines, was calling. Marcus put the call on speaker so Claire could hear everything. Victoria's voice came through sounding strained and tired. She began by apologizing profusely for the incident at the Los Angeles airport. She told Marcus that Patricia Stone had been terminated immediately, and that the airline was conducting a comprehensive review of all gate procedures. She said the company took these matters very seriously and was committed to ensuring nothing like this ever happened again. Marcus listened to the entire speech without interrupting. When Victoria finished, he asked her a simple question. He wanted to know how many other discrimination complaints Skyline Airlines had received in the past 5 years. Victoria hesitated and said she would need to check with her legal team to get exact numbers. Marcus told her that he already knew the answer because his lawyer had obtained public records. There had been 47 formal complaints filed with government agencies and probably hundreds more that never became official complaints. He asked Victoria what specific actions the airline had taken in response to those 47 documented cases. Victoria was quiet for several seconds. Finally, she admitted that most complaints had been handled individually, rather than being examined as part of a larger pattern. Marcus told her that individual responses to systemic problems would never create real change. He said that firing Patricia Stone might make for good publicity, but it did nothing to address the culture that allowed someone like Patricia to work for the company for 15 years, despite multiple complaints. He pointed out that the airline's executive leadership was almost entirely white and male, which meant that decisions about diversity and inclusion were being made by people who had never personally experienced discrimination. Victoria asked Marcus what he wanted from the airline. She said the company was willing to make things right and would consider any reasonable requests he had. Marcus smiled because this was the opening he had been waiting for. He told Victoria that he was not interested in a personal settlement or a private apology. What he wanted was fundamental transformation of how the airline operated. He laid out his demands in clear terms. First, the airline needed to hire an independent civil rights organization to audit every aspect of its operations, including hiring practices, training programs, and customer service procedures. Second, the company needed to create an independent passenger advocate office with real power to investigate complaints and impose consequences. Third, the airline needed to implement body cameras for all gate agents and flight attendants so that interactions with passengers could be reviewed. Fourth, executive compensation needed to be tied to measurable diversity and inclusion goals. Victoria listened to all of this and then said that such changes would require approval from the board of directors and would take significant time and resources to implement. Marcus told her that he understood the complexity, but that complexity was not an excuse for inaction. He said he was prepared to invest $200 million of his own money into Skyline Airlines, but only under specific conditions. He wanted a seat on the board of directors with full voting rights. He wanted direct oversight of all diversity initiatives. He wanted quarterly public reports showing measurable progress toward equality goals. And if the airline was not willing to accept these terms, then he would use that same $200 million to start his own airline that would do things correctly from the beginning. The silence on the phone lasted almost a full minute. Claire watched Marcus with admiration because she knew how much courage it took to make such bold demands. Victoria finally spoke again, and her voice had changed. She sounded less like someone doing damage control and more like someone who realized she was facing a person who would not back down. She told Marcus that she would need to present his proposal to the board of directors, but that she personally believed the airline needed exactly the kind of transformation he was describing. She asked for 48 hours to discuss everything with the board and get back to him with an answer. Marcus agreed to wait 48 hours, but not a minute longer. He ended the call and looked at Claire, who was shaking her head in amazement. She told him that in 20 years of practicing law, she had never seen anyone negotiate from such a position of strength. Most people who experienced discrimination just wanted compensation and an apology. Marcus was demanding nothing less than a complete restructuring of a major corporation. Claire warned him that the board might reject his proposal because boards did not like outsiders telling them how to run their companies. Marcus said he was counting on that possibility because starting his own airline would give him even more control and would send a powerful message to the entire industry. Over the next 2 days, Marcus continued to prepare for both possible outcomes. If Skyline Airlines accepted his terms, he would need to move quickly to begin implementing changes. If they rejected his proposal, he would need to start building an airline from scratch, which would require assembling a team of aviation experts and securing aircraft and routes and government approvals. Either path would be difficult, but Marcus had built his technology company from nothing, and he knew that determination and smart planning could overcome almost any obstacle. News of Marcus's demands leaked to the media on the second day. Reporters started calling it the boldest corporate activism they had seen in years. Business analysts debated whether an airline could successfully implement such dramatic changes. Unions representing flight attendants and pilots issued statements supporting Marcus and calling for industry-wide reforms. Other airlines watched nervously because they knew that if Skyline agreed to these terms, they would face pressure to do the same. On the morning of the third day, Victoria called Marcus again. Her voice sounded both exhausted and relieved. She told Marcus that the board of directors had met for 7 hours the previous evening, debating his proposal. The vote had not been unanimous, but the majority had recognized that the airline faced a critical moment. They could either resist change and face mounting public pressure and declining business, or they could embrace transformation and potentially emerge as an industry leader. The board had voted to accept all of Marcus's terms. He would receive a seat on the board with full voting rights. His $200 million investment would be used specifically for diversity initiatives and systemic reforms. He would have oversight authority, and quarterly reporting requirements would be implemented. Marcus thanked Victoria and told her that he looked forward to working together to create something better. After ending the call, he sat back in his chair and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was just the beginning, and he knew the real work would be much harder than the negotiation. Changing corporate culture required sustained effort over years, not months. There would be resistance from employees who felt threatened by change, and from customers who preferred the old ways. There would be setbacks and failures and moments when progress seemed impossible. But Marcus had never been afraid of hard work, and he had never backed down from a challenge that mattered. Claire came into his office carrying a bottle of champagne that she had been keeping, ready for either celebration or commiseration. She popped the cork and poured 2 glasses. She raised her glass in a toast to Marcus and told him that history would remember this moment. Marcus raised his own glass but said that history only mattered if they followed through on every promise they had made. The real test would come in the implementation, and that was where most reform efforts failed. People made grand announcements and held press conferences, but then quietly abandoned their commitments when things got difficult. Marcus was determined that would not happen this time. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime that echoed through the cabin. Marcus unbuckled and pulled out his laptop from his briefcase because work had always been his way of processing difficult emotions. But before he could open any documents, Kelly approached his seat again. She looked nervous and spoke in a quiet voice to avoid disturbing the other first-class passengers. She told Marcus that the captain wanted to speak with him personally if he was willing to have that conversation. Marcus agreed because he was curious about what the captain would say. Captain Richard Hayes appeared a few minutes later, after making sure his co-pilot had control of the aircraft. Richard was in his late 50s with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes from years of squinting at instruments and horizons. He crouched down in the aisle next to Marcus's seat so they could talk at eye level. Richard introduced himself and then launched into an apology that sounded genuine and unrehearsed. He said he had been flying for this airline for 28 years, and what happened at the gate did not represent the values he believed in or tried to uphold. He explained that he had already filed a formal complaint with the airline's headquarters about Patricia Stone's behavior. He told Marcus that Patricia had been suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Marcus appreciated the apology, but he had heard similar words before from people who meant well, but changed nothing. He told Richard respectfully that this was not about one employee having a bad day or making a mistake. This was about a system that allowed these situations to happen in the first place. He asked Richard how many other passengers had been treated this way, but did not have cameras recording or millions of followers on social media or the financial resources to fight back. Richard opened his mouth to respond but then closed it again, because he had no good answer to that question. Marcus could see in the captain's eyes that he understood the deeper problem even if he did not know how to solve it. Richard stood up and adjusted his uniform and promised Marcus that he would personally make sure this incident received the attention it deserved at the highest levels of the company. Marcus thanked him and Richard returned to the cockpit. Kelly brought Marcus a hot towel and asked if he wanted lunch, but Marcus was not hungry. His mind was racing with thoughts about what came next and how he would handle the situation. He decided to check his phone before they landed in New York. The flight would arrive in about 4 more hours, and by then the story would have had time to spread across the internet. Marcus tried to focus on work, but concentration was impossible. He kept thinking about the look on Patricia's face when she saw Greg Hamilton. He kept replaying the way she had called security as if he was some kind of criminal. He thought about all the young black professionals who would face similar treatment and might not have the confidence or resources to stand up for themselves. He thought about teenagers and college students who would learn from these experiences that they were not welcome in certain spaces. The anger inside him transformed into something else. It became determination. The rest of the flight passed slowly. Marcus made notes on his laptop about what he remembered from the incident. He wrote down exact quotes as best as he could recall them. He noted the time and location and the names of everyone involved. He had learned in business that documentation was everything. Without proof, people could deny and dismiss and distort the truth. But with clear evidence and multiple witnesses, the truth became much harder to ignore. Other passengers in first class kept glancing at him throughout the flight. Some looked sympathetic while others seemed uncomfortable. One older white woman smiled at him kindly, and he nodded back in acknowledgement. When the plane finally descended toward New York, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The landing was smooth and the plane taxied to the gate without any problems. Marcus waited for most of the other passengers to exit before standing up. He wanted to avoid any awkward conversations or questions from strangers. Kelly appeared one last time as he gathered his briefcase. She handed him a card with her full name and employee number written on it. She told him to please contact her if he needed a witness statement about what had happened. Marcus was moved by this gesture because Kelly did not have to put herself at risk by offering to testify against her employer. He thanked her sincerely and promised he would be in touch. The jetway at New York's airport was crowded with passengers from other flights. Marcus made his way through the terminal toward baggage claim, where his lawyer was supposed to meet him. Claire Mitchell had been his attorney for 5 years, and she specialized in civil rights law. Marcus had called her from the airport security office in Los Angeles, and she had immediately caught a flight to meet him in New York. Claire was in her early 40s with short dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She stood near the baggage carousel holding a tablet computer and watching for Marcus. When she saw him approaching, her expression became very serious. She held up the tablet and showed him the screen. Marcus saw his own face on a video that had millions of views already. The video showed the entire interaction at the gate, including Patricia's dismissive attitude and her warm welcome to Greg Hamilton and the arrival of security officers. Someone had edited together footage from multiple phones to create a complete record of everything that happened. The video had been shared across every major social media platform. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own stories of discrimination while traveling. Claire scrolled through news websites on her tablet and showed Marcus headline after headline. Major news outlets were covering the story. Television networks were requesting interviews. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements of support. The hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack was trending nationwide. The airline's official social media accounts were being overwhelmed with angry comments demanding answers and accountability. The company's stock price had dropped 3% in the past few hours as investors worried about public relations damage and potential lawsuits. Marcus took the tablet and read through several articles while they waited for his luggage. The coverage was extensive and detailed. Reporters had already dug up information about Patricia Stone, including complaints from other passengers over the years that had been ignored or dismissed. They had found statistics showing that black passengers were more likely to be questioned about tickets and more likely to be removed from flights for subjective behavior concerns. They had interviewed aviation experts who confirmed that racial profiling in air travel was a documented problem that airlines rarely address seriously. Claire told Marcus that the airline's public relations team had been calling her office nonstop for the past 2 hours. They wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss the situation and find a resolution. Claire had told them that any meeting would happen on Marcus's timeline and terms, not theirs. She asked Marcus what he wanted to do next. He could file a lawsuit and seek monetary damages. He could accept a private settlement with confidentiality agreements. He could use this moment of public attention to demand larger changes in the industry. The choice was his to make. Marcus grabbed his suitcase from the carousel and they walked toward the parking garage where Claire's car was waiting. He told Claire that he did not want money for himself. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. What he wanted was something much bigger and much harder to achieve. He wanted systematic change across the entire airline industry. He wanted policies that protected passengers from discrimination. He wanted accountability for employees who abused their power. He wanted diversity in leadership positions so that decisions were made by people who understood what it felt like to be treated as suspicious or dangerous, simply because of their appearance. Claire listened to everything, Marcus said, and then smiled in a way that showed both respect and excitement. She told him that what he was describing would require a massive effort that could take years to accomplish. It would mean fighting not just one airline, but an entire industry that had resisted change for decades. It would mean dealing with lawyers and executives and politicians who would all try to minimize the problem and protect their interests. It would require persistence and strategy and the willingness to stay in the fight even when progress seemed impossible. She asked Marcus if he was truly ready for that kind of battle. Marcus looked out at the New York skyline as they drove through evening traffic. He thought about his parents who had worked multiple jobs to send him to college. He thought about his grandmother who had lived through segregation and told him stories about separate water fountains and bus seats. He thought about his own children who deserved to grow up in a world where they were judged by their character and abilities rather than their skin color. He told Claire that he was absolutely ready. Marcus stood behind a podium in the main conference room of his company headquarters 3 days after reaching the agreement with Skyline Airlines. The room was packed with reporters from every major news outlet in the country. Television cameras lined the back wall and photographers crowded near the front. The air buzzed with anticipation because everyone knew this press conference would be significant. Claire stood off to one side with other members of Marcus's team. His public relations director had spent the previous day coordinating logistics and preparing materials for the media. Marcus wore a dark gray suit with a blue tie and he looked calm despite the dozens of cameras pointed at him. He had written his speech himself because he wanted every word to be authentic and true to his vision. He began by thanking everyone for coming and acknowledging that the past week had been difficult, but also illuminating. He said that what happened to him at the Los Angeles airport was wrong, but it was not unique or unusual. Thousands of people experience similar treatment every single day while traveling, and most of them had no platform to share their stories. The difference between his situation and theirs was not that his dignity mattered more, but that he had resources and visibility that could be used to create change for everyone. He explained that over the past week his team had collected hundreds of personal accounts from people who had been discriminated against while flying. Teachers and nurses and students and parents had reached out to share stories of being questioned about ticket legitimacy or being removed from flights for vague behavior concerns or being denied upgrades they had earned. The common thread in nearly all these stories was that the people being targeted were black or brown or wore religious clothing that marked them as different. Marcus said these patterns were not coincidental or accidental, but were the result of systemic problems in how airlines trained employees and handled complaints. He announced that he had reached an agreement with Skyline Airlines to implement comprehensive reforms over the next 2 years. He would join their board of directors and would oversee diversity initiatives with full authority to make necessary changes. The airline had committed to independent audits, accountability measures, body cameras for employees, and regular public reporting on progress. Marcus emphasized that these changes would only matter if they were followed through completely and consistently. He said he would not allow this to become another empty corporate promise that faded away after the media attention died down. Then Marcus shifted to talking about something even bigger than his agreement with one airline. He announced the creation of the Webb Foundation's Dignity in Travel program, with an initial funding commitment of $100 million. This program would provide free legal support to anyone who experienced discrimination while traveling, regardless of whether they could afford a lawyer. The foundation would maintain a database of complaints and patterns across different airlines, and would publish annual reports showing which companies were improving and which were not. The goal was to make discrimination costly and public so that companies would have strong incentives to fix their problems. Marcus looked directly at the cameras and spoke with conviction about why this mattered so much to him. He said that dignity was not something people should have to fight for or earn through success. Every person deserved to be treated with basic respect, regardless of their race or appearance or economic status. He said that he had built his company through hard work and intelligence, but he had also benefited from luck and opportunity and support from others. Using his resources to help people who did not have those same advantages was not charity but obligation. The speech lasted 15 minutes, and when he finished, the room erupted with questions from reporters. One journalist asked whether Marcus believed the airline industry would really change or if this was just performative activism. Marcus responded that change would only happen if people remained vigilant and continued demanding accountability. He said that corporations responded to pressure from customers and investors and public opinion. As long as people kept paying attention and kept speaking up, then progress was possible. Another reporter asked if Marcus planned to take similar action in other industries where discrimination was common. Marcus said he was focused on air travel for now, but that the same principles could apply anywhere that systemic inequality existed. A television news anchor asked Marcus what message he had for young black professionals who might face similar discrimination in their careers. Marcus paused before answering because he wanted to get this exactly right. He said that racism was exhausting and demoralizing and sometimes felt overwhelming, but giving up or accepting mistreatment was never the answer. He told young people to document everything, build strong networks of support, and remember that their worth was not determined by how others treated them. He said that success was the best response to those who doubted or dismissed them. Every achievement and milestone proved the doubters wrong and opened doors for others who would come after. The press conference lasted almost an hour, with Marcus answering questions about legal strategy and timeline for reforms and his personal feelings about what had happened. When it finally ended, he felt exhausted but also energized. Claire approached him as reporters began packing up their equipment. She told him that the coverage would be overwhelmingly positive and that public opinion was strongly on his side, but she also warned him that maintaining that momentum would require constant effort. The news cycle moved quickly and people's attention spans were short. The hard work of actually implementing reforms would happen mostly out of the public eye, and that was when many reform efforts collapsed. Marcus knew she was right. He had seen too many social movements that started with passion and righteous anger, but fizzled out when the work became tedious and complicated. He was determined that would not happen this time. He had committed his own money and reputation to this cause, and he would see it through no matter how long it took. Over the next several weeks, Marcus divided his time between running his technology company and working with Skyline Airlines on reform initiatives. The airline had formed a special committee to oversee the changes, and Marcus chaired that committee with authority to approve or reject proposals. The first major decision was selecting an independent organization to conduct the audit of airline operations. Marcus insisted on choosing a civil rights group with a strong track record and no financial ties to the aviation industry. The audit would examine hiring practices at every level, from baggage handlers to executives. It would review training materials and procedures for handling customer complaints. It would analyze data about which passengers were questioned about tickets or removed from flights. The audit would take 6 months to complete, and the results would be made public regardless of what they revealed. Some board members at Skyline Airlines were nervous about such transparency. They worried that negative findings would damage the company's reputation and stock price. Marcus told them that hiding problems never made them go away, and that customers would respect honesty more than cover-ups. The board reluctantly agreed, and the audit began. Meanwhile, Marcus pushed for immediate changes that did not require months of study. Body cameras were ordered for all gate agents and flight attendants with policies about when they must be activated. A new passenger advocate office was created with 5 full-time staff members who had no ties to airline management. Their job was to investigate complaints independently and recommend disciplinary action when appropriate. The changes were not popular with everyone. Some employees complained that body cameras were intrusive and showed a lack of trust. Some managers resented having an independent office with authority to question their decisions. Marcus heard these complaints but remained firm. He told critics that accountability was not punishment but protection. Good employees who treated passengers fairly had nothing to fear from cameras or oversight. The only people who should worry were those who had been abusing their authority or discriminating against customers. Kelly Brooks, the flight attendant who had tried to help Marcus at the gate, was promoted to a new position as training coordinator. Her job was to develop education programs about unconscious bias and customer service for all airline employees. Kelly was nervous about the responsibility, but Marcus had seen her character during the incident and knew she would approach the work with integrity. He met with her several times to discuss training methods and content. Kelly told him that many employees genuinely wanted to do better, but had never received proper education about discrimination. They had been taught technical skills like safety, procedures but not interpersonal skills like recognizing their own biases. Marcus agreed and emphasized that training needed to be ongoing, rather than a one-time session that people forgot. He wanted quarterly refresher courses and regular testing to ensure employees retained what they learned. He also insisted that managers and executives receive the same training as frontline workers. Too often, leadership teams exempted themselves from diversity initiatives, while demanding that lower-level employees change their behavior. The changes at Skyline Airlines were being watched closely by the entire aviation industry, and the effects were spreading beyond just one company. Other airlines faced mounting pressure from customers and employees to implement similar reforms. Social media campaigns called out companies that had poor records on discrimination. Investors began asking questions about diversity initiatives during shareholder meetings. The business case for reform was becoming impossible to ignore because studies showed that companies with better equality practices also had better customer loyalty and employee retention. 3. Major airlines reached out to Marcus, asking for advice on starting their own reform programs. He agreed to meet with their leadership teams but made clear that he would only help companies that were genuinely committed to change, rather than just trying to improve their public image. Marcus had developed a reputation for being able to tell the difference between sincere intentions and corporate performance. He asked tough questions about budget commitments and timeline expectations and leadership accountability. Companies that gave vague answers or tried to minimize the scope of needed changes did not receive his assistance. One airline that impressed Marcus was a smaller regional carrier whose chief executive officer was a woman named Ruth Palmer. Ruth had built her company from just 3 planes to a fleet of 40 over 15 years. She contacted Marcus and told him honestly that her airline had problems with discrimination that she had not fully recognized until his story went public. She said that reading the audit results from Skyline Airlines had been like looking in a mirror and seeing flaws she had been blind to. Ruth asked Marcus to help her company conduct a similar audit and implement reforms before problems became public scandals. Marcus respected Ruth's honesty and proactive approach. He connected her with Dr. Helen Carter, who agreed to conduct an audit of the regional airline. Marcus also shared some of the training materials and policy templates that Skyline had developed so that Ruth's company did not have to start from scratch. Ruth implemented changes quickly and transparently, announcing to her employees and customers that the company was committed to becoming an industry leader in equality and inclusion. Her stock price actually increased after the announcement because investors recognized that addressing problems early was smarter than waiting for a crisis. The Webb Foundation's Dignity in Travel program was receiving hundreds of requests for assistance every month. Marcus had hired a team of lawyers and case managers to evaluate complaints and provide support to people who had experienced discrimination. The foundation prioritized cases that could set important legal precedents or that involved particularly egregious behavior. They also tracked patterns across different airlines and published quarterly reports showing which companies had the most complaints and which had the fewest. These public reports created competitive pressure because no company wanted to be listed as the worst offender. Some airlines tried to fight back against the transparency by arguing that complaint numbers were not fair comparisons because different airlines served different markets. Marcus responded by adjusting the reports to show complaints per million passengers, which accounted for company size and flight volume. The adjusted numbers showed that the problems were not about market differences but about company culture and policies. Airlines with strong accountability measures had dramatically fewer complaints than those without such measures. Congress began holding hearings about discrimination in air travel, partly because of the attention Marcus's case had generated. Several members of Congress invited Marcus to testify about his experiences and his recommendations for federal policy changes. Marcus prepared carefully for his testimony because he knew that legislative action could create industry-wide standards rather than relying on individual companies to reform themselves. He spent days reviewing federal aviation regulations and consulting with policy experts about what changes were both necessary and politically feasible. When Marcus testified before Congress, he wore a simple, dark suit and spoke calmly but forcefully about the need for federal standards. He explained that voluntary corporate reforms were important but insufficient because companies that made costly changes to promote equality were at a competitive disadvantage compared to companies that did nothing. Federal requirements would level the playing field and ensure that all airlines met minimum standards for equal treatment of passengers. He proposed mandatory reporting of discrimination complaints, regular independent audits, and financial penalties for airlines with patterns of discriminatory behavior. Some members of Congress were supportive, while others worried about imposing regulatory burdens on businesses. Marcus countered that treating all customers with dignity should not be considered a burden, but a basic expectation. He pointed out that airlines were heavily regulated in areas like safety and maintenance because lives were at stake. He argued that human dignity was also important enough to justify regulation. Several civil rights organizations testified in support of Marcus's proposals and shared research showing that discrimination in travel had broad negative effects on communities and economic opportunity. The media coverage of the congressional hearings was extensive and kept the issue of travel discrimination in the public consciousness. Marcus did dozens of interviews with news programs and podcasts explaining why the reforms mattered. He was careful to always frame the issue as being about fairness and human dignity, rather than about himself personally. He shared stories from other people who had contacted the Webb Foundation with experiences of discrimination. He wanted the public to understand that this was not just about one wealthy person being inconvenienced, but about systemic injustice affecting millions. Victoria Lang told Marcus that Skyline Airlines was seeing measurable improvements in multiple areas because of the reforms. Employee satisfaction scores had increased, especially among staff from underrepresented groups who felt that the company finally took their concerns seriously. Customer complaints about discrimination had dropped by 78% compared to the previous year. Customer satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement among passengers of color. The airline had hired more diverse staff in the past year than in the previous 5 years combined. 6 executives had been promoted from within the company who brought perspectives that had been missing from leadership discussions. The financial performance of Skyline Airlines had also recovered and even improved. After the initial stock price drop following the incident, the company had rebounded strongly. Investors recognized that the reforms were making the airline more resilient and better positioned for long-term success. Corporate clients who had threatened to cancel contracts had renewed them, and several new corporate accounts had been secured specifically because of the company's demonstrated commitment to equality. The business case for treating people fairly was proving itself in the most concrete terms possible. Marcus was invited to speak at a conference for airline executives, where he could address leaders from across the industry. He accepted the invitation because it was an opportunity to influence people who had the power to implement changes at their own companies. The conference was held at a resort in Colorado with hundreds of executives attending. Marcus was scheduled to give the keynote address at the closing dinner. He spent the day before his speech walking around the conference and listening to conversations among the executives. He heard some expressing genuine interest in reform and others dismissing the whole topic as political correctness that would fade away soon. When Marcus took the stage for his keynote address, the room was packed and quiet. He began by acknowledging that many people in the audience probably wished he had just accepted an apology and moved on, rather than forcing an entire industry to examine itself. He said he understood that change was uncomfortable and that reform efforts created extra work for already busy people. But he asked everyone in the room to consider what kind of industry they wanted to be part of and what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. He talked about the history of aviation and how flying had once been a luxury available only to the wealthy and privileged. Over decades, the industry had worked to make air travel accessible to more people through lower prices and expanded routes. But accessibility meant nothing if people were made to feel unwelcome or unsafe because of their race or religion or appearance. He said that the aviation industry had the opportunity to be a leader in equality, just as it had been a leader in innovation and accessibility. Companies that embraced this opportunity would thrive, while those that resisted would eventually be left behind by changing social expectations and market demands. Marcus shared data showing that diverse companies were more profitable and innovative than homogeneous companies. He explained that this was not just a moral argument, but a business argument. Companies that alienated customers through discrimination were losing market share to competitors who treated everyone well. Companies that failed to hire and promote diverse talent were missing out on the best people. The smart business decision and the right moral decision were the same decision. 1 year after the incident at the Los Angeles airport, Marcus stood in front of a new building that represented the tangible legacy of everything that had happened. The Webb Center for Aviation Excellence was a state-of-the-art training facility that would educate thousands of aviation professionals every year. The building had cost $60 million to construct and was equipped with flight simulators, classroom spaces, and training areas for every aspect of airline operations. But the center was about more than just technical skills. Its mission was to train aviation workers who were not only competent but also committed to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. The opening ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including airline executives, government officials, civil rights leaders, and students who would be among the first to train at the facility. Kelly Brooks stood beside Marcus as the director of training programs for the center. She had left her position at Skyline Airlines to take on this broader role, developing curriculum that would be used across the industry. Kelly told the crowd that the center would offer programs ranging from basic customer service training to advanced leadership development. Every program would include substantial focus on equality, bias recognition, and inclusive service. Marcus gave a speech at the ceremony that reflected on the journey of the past year. He talked about how a moment of humiliation had been transformed into an opportunity for systemic change. He acknowledged that the work was far from finished and that creating lasting change would require sustained effort over many years. But he also celebrated the progress that had been made. Discrimination complaints across the aviation industry had decreased by 40% compared to the previous year. 5 major airlines had implemented comprehensive reform programs modeled on what Skyline had done. Congress had passed legislation requiring annual diversity audits for airlines receiving federal subsidies. The business culture was shifting, even if slowly. He introduced several people whose lives had been changed by the reforms. A young black woman named Carmen Rodriguez had been a college student who experienced discrimination on a budget airline. The Webb Foundation had helped her file a successful complaint and win a settlement. Carmen used that settlement money to enroll in flight school and was now training to become a commercial pilot. She told the audience that she used to think the sky was not for people who looked like her, but that Marcus had helped prove that belief wrong. She promised to treat every passenger with respect when she became a captain and to mentor other young people from underrepresented communities who wanted careers in aviation. An older Latino man named Carlos Mendez shared his story of being removed from a flight 3 years earlier because a flight attendant claimed he was acting suspiciously. Carlos had done nothing wrong but had been escorted off the plane in front of his family and other passengers. The humiliation had been so severe that he avoided flying for years afterward. But after hearing about Marcus's case, Carlos had contacted the Webb Foundation, which helped him file a complaint. The airline had been forced to acknowledge wrongdoing and implement better training for its staff. Carlos said that being heard and having his dignity recognized had been more important than any financial settlement. Marcus listened to these stories and felt the weight of responsibility that came with his platform and resources. He knew that his wealth and visibility had given him opportunities to create change that most people would never have. That privilege came with an obligation to use it well. He thought about all the people whose stories would never be told publicly, but whose lives were affected by whether airlines treated them fairly. He thought about the single mother trying to get home to her children after a business trip. He thought about the elderly immigrant visiting family in another city. He thought about the teenager traveling alone for the first time. All of them deserved to be treated with basic human dignity, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. The Webb Foundation's Dignity in Travel program had grown beyond just providing legal assistance for individual complaints. The foundation now funded research on discrimination in transportation and published reports that influenced public policy. It provided grants to organizations working on aviation diversity and inclusion. It offered scholarships to students from underrepresented communities who wanted to study aviation management or engineering or piloting. The foundation had become a permanent institution that would continue its work long after the immediate publicity from Marcus's case had faded. Marcus had also kept his promise to hold Skyline Airlines accountable for continued progress. The quarterly reports on diversity metrics were published on the company's website for everyone to see. The numbers showed steady improvement in hiring, promotion, and customer satisfaction. But Marcus did not let the company become complacent. He regularly questioned executives about areas where progress was slow and pushed for more aggressive action. Some board members found his persistent pressure frustrating, but Victoria Lang supported him because she had come to believe that the reforms were making the airline stronger. The Utter body camera program had proven especially valuable. The cameras had recorded hundreds of interactions between employees and passengers. In the vast majority of cases, the footage showed employees doing their jobs professionally and treating passengers well. But the cameras had also captured several incidents of discriminatory behavior that might otherwise have been denied or covered up. Those employees had been disciplined or fired depending on the severity of their actions. More importantly, the knowledge that interactions were being recorded had changed behavior. Employees were more careful and thoughtful about how they treated passengers when they knew footage could be reviewed. Captain Richard Hayes had been promoted to a leadership role in pilot training where he continued to advocate for equality and inclusion. He developed a program to recruit pilots from diverse backgrounds and worked with flight schools to provide scholarships and mentorship. Richard told Marcus that being part of the reform effort had given him a sense of purpose beyond just flying planes. He said that many pilots felt the same way and appreciated being part of an industry that was trying to do better. Not every airline had embraced reform with the same commitment as Skyline. Some companies made minimal changes designed to create good publicity without addressing underlying problems. The Webb Foundation's quarterly reports called out these companies by name and contrasted their lack of progress with airlines that were making genuine efforts. Market pressure and customer preferences gradually pushed even resistant companies toward improvement because passengers increasingly chose to fly with airlines that had reputations for treating everyone fairly. Patricia Stone had become a symbol of what the industry was trying to move away from. Her name was mentioned in training sessions as an example of how personal bias could harm both passengers and the company that employed someone who acted on such bias. Patricia had tried to find another job in the aviation industry, but her termination and the circumstances around it had made her unemployable in that field. She eventually found work in a completely different industry, but her career in aviation was over. Marcus felt no particular satisfaction in her downfall, because he had never wanted to destroy her personally, but he recognized that consequences were necessary to show that discriminatory behavior would not be tolerated. Marcus received an email one evening from a young man named Joshua Turner who lived in a small town in Georgia. Joshua was 16 years old and black, and he wrote that he had always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but had assumed it was impossible for someone like him. He said that watching Marcus stand up for himself and create change had inspired him to believe that maybe he could achieve his dreams too. Joshua asked Marcus for advice about how to prepare for a career in aviation. Marcus wrote back with detailed suggestions about courses to take in school and flight schools to consider, and scholarship programs that could help with costs. He also invited Joshua to visit the Webb Center for Aviation Excellence, where he could meet pilots and see training facilities. Several months later, Joshua and his mother traveled to visit the center. Marcus spent an entire afternoon with them showing Joshua the simulators and introducing him to instructors and pilots. He watched the teenager's face light up with excitement and possibility. That evening, Marcus reflected on how far things had come in just over a year. One act of discrimination had been transformed into a movement that was changing an entire industry. One moment of anger had been channeled into sustained action that was creating opportunities for thousands of people. It was not perfect and the work was not finished, but real progress was being made. Marcus knew that there would always be more work to do. Discrimination and bias were deeply rooted in society and could not be eliminated through a single lawsuit or reform program. But what had started at Gate 47 in Los Angeles had proven that change was possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Marcus had used his resources and platform to fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had been treated as less than human because of how they looked. 6 months after the incident at Los Angeles Airport, Marcus sat in the Skyline Airlines boardroom, waiting for the presentation of the audit results. The independent civil rights organization had spent half a year examining every aspect of the airline's operations. They had interviewed over 500 employees at all levels. They had reviewed 10 years of customer complaint records. They had analyzed data about passenger interactions and flight removals and upgrade denials. They had studied training materials and hiring practices and promotion patterns. The lead auditor was a woman named Dr. Helen Carter who had spent 30 years documenting discrimination. In corporate America, Dr. Carter stood at the front of the boardroom with a thick report in her hands and a serious expression on her face. The other board members sat around the large conference table looking nervous. Victoria Lang sat at the head of the table with her hands folded tightly. Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders and knew she was worried about what the audit would reveal. Dr. Carter began her presentation by explaining the methodology and scope of the investigation. She emphasized that the audit team had been given complete access to all records and personnel without any interference from airline management. The findings were damning but not surprising to Marcus. Dr. Carter showed statistics proving that black passengers were 3 times more likely than white passengers to be questioned about ticket legitimacy. Passengers wearing religious clothing were twice as likely to be selected for additional screening beyond normal security procedures. Latino passengers were more likely to be removed from flights for vague complaints about disruptive behavior, even when flight attendants could not provide specific examples of what rules were broken. The patterns were clear and consistent across different airports and time periods. The audit also revealed problems in hiring and promotion. The airline's workforce was 68% white, despite operating in cities with much more diverse populations. Management positions were 85% white and 79% male. Complaints about discrimination from employees were rarely investigated thoroughly, and even when investigations confirmed wrongdoing, the consequences were usually minimal. Patricia Stone had received 3 previous complaints about treating passengers differently based on race, but each time she had been given a warning with no real consequences. The airline had a pattern of protecting problem employees rather than holding them accountable. Training materials were outdated and superficial. New employees received 2 hours of diversity training during their initial orientation and then never received follow-up education. The training focused on legal compliance rather than actual understanding of bias and discrimination. Employees were taught what they legally could not do, but not how to recognize their own prejudices or provide truly equal service. The audit team had tested current employees with scenarios involving passenger interactions and found that many made different decisions based solely on the described race of the hypothetical passenger. Dr. Carter presented all of this information with charts and graphs that made the evidence impossible to deny. Some board members looked uncomfortable, while others looked defensive. One older board member tried to argue that some of the statistical differences could be explained by factors other than discrimination. Dr. Carter calmly responded that the audit team had controlled for every reasonable variable, including ticket prices, destinations, time of travel, and passenger behavior. The disparities remained significant even after accounting for all those factors. Marcus spoke up and thanked Dr. Carter for the thorough and honest work. He said that facing uncomfortable truths was the only way to create real change. He looked around the table at his fellow board members and told them that they now had a choice. They could accept the findings and commit to serious reforms, or they could make excuses and maintain the status quo. But he wanted everyone to understand that maintaining the status quo was no longer an option, because the audit results would be made public regardless of what the board decided to do. Victoria took a deep breath and said that the airline accepted the findings and was committed to implementing every recommendation in the audit report. Dr. Carter's team had provided 63 specific recommendations, ranging from revised training programs to changes in hiring practices to new accountability measures. Victoria proposed creating task forces to address each major area, with deadlines for implementation. Marcus agreed, but insisted that he would personally oversee the task forces to ensure that timelines were met and that reforms were meaningful rather than cosmetic. Over the next several weeks, Marcus worked with airline staff to begin implementing changes. The hiring process was completely overhauled with new requirements for diverse candidate pools and structured interviews designed to reduce bias. All job postings were reviewed to remove language that might discourage diverse applicants. Recruiters were sent to colleges and job fairs in communities that had been historically underrepresented in aviation careers. The airline partnered with organizations that supported women and minorities interested in aviation to create pipeline programs for future employees. Training was transformed from a brief orientation session into an ongoing education requirement. Every employee would receive quarterly training on topics like unconscious bias, cultural competency, and conflict resolution. The training would include realistic scenarios and role-playing exercises rather than just lectures and videos. Employees would be tested on their understanding, and their performance evaluations would include specific metrics about providing equal service to all passengers. Managers who supervised frontline workers would receive additional training on how to identify and address discriminatory behavior on their teams. The passenger complaint system was redesigned to be more transparent and accessible. Previously, passengers had to navigate a complicated phone system or fill out forms that often went unanswered. The new system included a simple website where complaints could be filed with automatic tracking numbers. The Independent Passenger Advocate Office would review every complaint within 48 hours and contact the passenger to explain what action would be taken. Complaints involving discrimination would trigger automatic investigations with findings reported to the board quarterly. Marcus insisted on creating real consequences for employees who engaged in discriminatory behavior. Previously, the worst punishment most employees faced was a verbal warning that went into a file but affected nothing. Under the new policies, any confirmed instance of discrimination would result in mandatory retraining for a first offense, suspension without pay for a second offense, and termination for a third offense. Serious cases could result in immediate termination even on a first offense. Managers who failed to address discrimination on their teams would face the same consequences. The body camera program was expanded after initial pilot testing showed positive results. Employees had been worried that cameras would be used to nitpick their every action, but the reality was different. The cameras primarily served to protect good employees from false complaints and to provide evidence when problems occurred. Several employees had actually requested cameras after incidents where passengers made untrue accusations. The footage showed what really happened and resolved disputes quickly. Kelly Brooks had been working hard on the training program and showed Marcus some of the new materials she had developed. The scenarios were realistic and challenging. One scenario described a passenger in traditional Muslim clothing being selected for extra screening, while a white passenger in casual clothes was waved through. Employees had to identify what was wrong with the situation and explain how they would handle it differently. Another scenario involved a black passenger with a first-class ticket being questioned by a gate agent while white passengers were not questioned. Employees had to recognize the discrimination and describe how they would intervene if they witnessed this happening. Marcus was impressed with the quality of the training materials and told Kelly that her work would have lasting impact. Kelly admitted that developing the scenarios had been emotionally difficult because she had to imagine herself in situations where colleagues were behaving badly. But she believed the discomfort was necessary because real change required people to confront ugly realities. Marcus agreed and said that growth always involved discomfort. People who were never challenged in their assumptions would never change their behavior. The reforms were beginning to show results after just a few months. Customer satisfaction surveys showed improvement, especially among passengers of color, who reported feeling more respected and welcomed. Complaint numbers actually increased at first, which worried some executives until Marcus explained that increased reporting was a good sign. It meant passengers felt their complaints would be taken seriously rather than ignored. As employees learned that discrimination would have real consequences, the number of discriminatory incidents began to decline. Not everyone was happy with the changes. 14 employees were fired in the first 6 months for documented patterns of discriminatory behavior. Several dozen more received suspensions or mandatory retraining.